on Krampus and the history of Krampus Night, and I will be doing so as Frau Perchta. My name is Frau Perchta, also known as Frau Perchta. You might call me in your language Lady Birch. I am known for many things. I am a mother goddess, first and foremost, living in Germany and Austria and other parts of the Alps. And I have a love of stories, and I love my geese, which is why some have called me Mother Goose. So tonight I will be sharing with you a story of one of my children, the Krampus. The Krampus is an often misunderstood creature of the Austrian Alps, but tonight we will hear the Krampus's story from me, Frau Perchta, Mother Goose. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy this story that you may have heard before, or maybe not, but is a story told by Mother Goose, and you all know that that means a good story.
Huzzah!
Once upon a time, picture, if you will, a dark mountainside in western Austria. The snow is falling, it is late at night, when comes the sound of bells. Bells running, and you look, and there is a group of men with horns on their heads, and goat and deer skins down their backs, running with bells from house to house on the mountain. And you look out the door of your home, and they are coming straight for you. So what do? Why, you welcome them inside. You offer them some beer and some bread, because it is, of course, a holy night, and these are men going about the duty of the Perchten. So, who are these Perchten? Well, there lived in the Alps of Austria me, Frau Perchta, and my helpers, the Perchten. I, of course, oversee the household. I wish to see every home spick and span and spotless. The floors should be swept, the looms should be clean, and there should be no loose threads on the distaff at the end of the night, and everything should be kept in good working order. But I cannot be everywhere at once, so my Perchten run about with their bells, and they look in these houses and they see, has the lady of the house been doing her job? If so, then I may leave a gift for her on this night. But if they've messed up and they've left threads all entangled on the distaff and there's dirt on the floor and everything's a mess, why, my Perchten will make a bigger mess! They'll knock over all the threads and they'll tangle up all the weaving and they'll make a horrible scene that will just terrify any housekeeper to death. But, of course, that is the way of it, and I also will take gifts, naturally, for my Perchten get hungry, as do I. And so if you leave on these nights a bowl of porridge, some bread and milk, nice beer, boiled milk, all kinds of yummy goodies, leave them out at the front of the home, and my Perchten might overlook a mistake or two on the loom. Perhaps a thread was left, but they might look the other way.
No big deal.
And say, num, 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 num. So delicious. Now, there is a third story and character you need to understand in this tale, and that is Saint Nicholas. Saint Nicholas lived far east of here, in the land now called Turkey, in the 4th century A.D. He did many good things, good and holy deeds, and has a couple of very interesting stories about him. Once upon a time, Nicholas was traveling and he came to an inn, and the innkeeper let him in, and he was going to stay there and have supper. Well, 3 boys had been passing down the road, and the wicked innkeeper decided that he was going to serve boy for dinner.
No.
Bad, bad, bad. We do not serve boys for dinner. But Sir Nicholas got wind of what was going to happen, and after the boys were chopped up and put in the stew, he grabbed the stew pot, he took out the bones, and miraculously, all 3 boys came back to life. Now, a funny thing about that innkeeper, up north in Germany, you will hear of a person named Knecht Rupert. They say Knecht Rupert is that very innkeeper, now forced to serve Sir Nicholas for all time. One possible thing that might happen, we don't know. I haven't really asked him. And so, of course, that was one story about jolly old St. Nicholas. And there's a second story, which is very relevant for this season. So his neighbor had been a wealthy man, but he lost all of his money and was now falling into poverty. And he had 3 daughters, who now did not have dowries for their marriages. So his neighbor, being a genius of a man, decided that instead he was going to sell his daughters into prostitution, since he couldn't afford their dowries. So St. Nick decided that he was going to save the day. One night at a time, he would climb to the roof of the house and drop a bag of gold down the chimney. And so one by one, each of the 3 daughters had a dowry and was able to have a happy marriage. And that is where St. Nicholas's chimney fetish
Yes.
comes from. So, you may be wondering, what do these 3 things have in common? And why am I telling you this story when I told you I was going to tell you about my son, the Krampus? Well, here's the thing. The thing to know about St. Nicholas is his feast day came at the beginning of Advent. At the beginning of December, right as the mountains were getting dark and cold and snowy and my Perchten were running about. And so his feast day became very closely linked with Christmas, since it came at the start of Advent, just a few weeks before one of the holiest days of the Christian calendar, when they celebrate the birth of their Jesus Christ. So, he soon was put as a figure in many plays, called Christmas pantomimes, about him and his life. And many of these pantomimes featured a devilish figure, who might have long, curly horns on the top of his head, and look a little bit like a goat.
Very handsome.
Very handsome gentleman indeed. So, these pantomimes really set up St. Nicholas as a popular Christmas time figure throughout Germany and Austria, where my Perchten lived. Now, those men dressed up as goats, running about from home to home with their bells. Well, here's the thing. Even my Perchten cannot get everywhere. So, they would go from house to house dressed up as Perchten, and they would get to enjoy the beer and milk and bread and other offerings that would be left out for us if we don't get there to eat them. So, of course, they were closely linked with me, Frau Perchta and Frau Perchta of Austria. Now, here is where things start to get interesting. So, as the Christian religion took over these regions about 2,000 years ago, the bishops decided that no one was allowed to dress up as a Perchten and run around, and they turned me, the mother goddess, into a frightful old hag with a giant ugly nose.
No!
This, by the way, is a beautiful nose. It looks just like the beak of my geese.
Beautiful.
It's a beautiful nose. But they said I was ugly and horrible and evil hag. And if you were found running about with your bells, dressed up as a goat, going door to door, why, you had 3 years of penance.
Ooh.
For being bad, for being devilish, for being associated with me.
Oh.
Well, luckily for these men and their goats and their bells, Most bishops were down in the cities, and they lived high up in the mountains. And it was cold, and it was snowy, and it was dark, and maybe the village priest would look the other way if he got to go along and have some beer too. So, it just went on and on and on, even though it wasn't allowed, even though it was given very bad names. So it went on. But at the same time, St. Nicholas was becoming entrenched as the good guy of the season. Instead of me, it was him, that dirty old codger. Boo!
Yes.
So, while I became a boogeyman, and my Perchten became the bad guys, he got all the good rap. Well, an interesting thing happened starting around the 11th to the 14th centuries. St. Nicholas stole my Perchten and named them Krampus. Krampus has always been a good name for them. They have their cloven hooves. It means cloven hoof. And so it's a good euphemistic name for them. But he stole them from me. And he decided that he was now going to be the benevolent good guy of the season. He would go from house to house, leading the Krampuses behind him with their bells. And he would be the good guy, while Krampus was the nasty character who would beat up the bad children and tattle on them and tell tales and do all kinds of nasty things. So, he became St. Nicholas's servant. But he was not just any old servant, but he was in charge of all the naughty children and spying on them, which is a good job.
Oh, yeah.
Good job indeed. One that they had plenty of job experience doing.
Yeah.
With their bells. So, I have here an example of what Krampus might say from various Tyrolean plays, as translated and adapted by Al Ridenour. I am Krampus, fear my name. Far and wide extends my fame. I arrive where I am bidden, and sniff out children where they're hidden. Who is naughty? Where's my prey? I'll tear them up without delay. Oh, Master Nicholas, I bring sad truth of deeds committed by these youths. For virtue will they seldom strive, but sin and vice in them do thrive. And of their idling in the streets, so boils my rage I cannot speak. And daily though I do my scrying, I've scarcely seen a child trying. Good children, though, are not my task, only for the bad I am asked. For those my sack is neatly suited, their vexing screams and whining muted. Off I pack them to their fates, those spoiled little reprobates. With brats as these, one choice is fit to toss them into the fiery pit. Bells! So that is, of course, the story of the Krampus and how he became St. Nicholas's little helper. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the recent history of Krampus and how he came to be how he is seen today. And for that we can thank the Austro-Hungarian post office. When the Austrian post office invented the postcard, they wanted a way to do a marketing campaign for it. And they chose, for their marketing campaign, to have a little-known regional figure of the Western Alps known as the Krampus to be on these cards with the words Gruß von Krampus. And so, of course, these cards were very popular. And being postcards, they traveled all over the world, spreading Krampus's name and fame far and wide. And I suspect, because you've probably heard this as well, that Krampus is descended from Cernunnos or Pan, the two gods of the hunt and the forest, within many Central European and Greek mythologies. Now here's the thing. Maybe he I'm not going to tell. But, of course, he is mine. He's descended from the Perchten, my Perchten, and their bells, and their horns. But here's where I suspect it came about, because these artists living in Vienna were not from the mountainous regions where my Perchten and my Krampuses run about. They were from the city, and they were classically trained artists who probably knew very well what a devil looked like, what a pan looked like, what, a goat-footed nature spirit looked like, because they had seen images of them from the Greeks. And so, when they were told, draw us a goat-footed devil from the Alps, they drew a creature who looked a lot like Satan and who looked a lot like Pan. And so a lot of that, I think, comes from that influence. He does come into the story, but a little later and a little sideways. The Perchten and the Krampuses, they're mine! So here is what a Krampus procession might look like. Remember, this all started with a bunch of men with bells, goat skins, and horns on their heads. Horns. Running about, singing and scaring people in exchange for food and beer. Then Nicholas moved into the picture, and by about the 17th and 18th centuries, he'd put a pretty solid Christian seal of approval on the proceedings. And so he is sort of in charge now, supposedly. He says he's in charge. So the house visit begins with Saint Nick, his basket bearer, and an angel knocking on the door. And they'll maybe sing a little welcoming song, and they're allowed inside the home. A bit like how the Mari Lou does it, actually. And he has this big golden book that records the names of all the children in all the world and their deeds for that year, which the parents then whisper to him as he comes inside so he can say, hey, little Marie, little Susie, little Joseph, I hear you're all very good at helping your parents in the garden this year. I love to hear that. Good children. And so then the children might recite some little passage, some little poetry that they memorized for Saint Nick. And then he gives them a little gift basket of fruit or nuts or some other little trinkets. And then comes the sound of bells! Bells! Incredibly loud bells, and here come the Krampuses with their huge masks and huge bells! And they're carrying little creatures to get the children with. And they go inside the home, and they dart about at one side of the room while the children cower on the other side. And it's all so much fun and so scary and so terrifying for the children. But no children get hurt. That's very important to remember. No children are harmed in the running of a Krampus lauf. No. Yeah. That's the rule. We can scare them, but we cannot hurt them. So, then, the Krampuses are allowed to kind of run about and do their thing, and then St. Nick blows his whistle. And then that puts an end to the Krampus' shenanigans. So, that is the way a Krampus house visit goes. And the Krampus can also be seen in Krampuslauf parades in many cities around the world. You'll see how we have one here in Tamarack with the Grove, where we all will run about the Grove with our bells and our Mario, and to music, and we have a great time. And that's what it's all about, is having a fun time. But in places where the Krampus has been running these for generations or centuries or millennia even, it's even more exciting, because there's very strict rules about what the Krampus can look like, do, growl, say, everything. Their masks on their faces are hand carved. No machine carving on most of these. It has to be hand carved. The mask can weigh between 10 and 30 pounds on their face with the horns. Some have multiple horns all over. 4 or 6 horns for a Perchten. And then the eyes are glowy and they have white hair running down the back of the mask. And then their body is a huge goat skin or sheep skin cape that covers their whole body in fur. And then they have the bells! These are giant brass bells that you can hear for miles on a snowy night. And they run with these bells behind them because the bells are a counterweight, actually, for the masks. Those masks are so heavy in the front that there would be toppling Krampuses if they didn't have as much weight at the back. So, then they also have switches. Now, in the olden days, the switches might be made of birch wood or cowtails, but those have kind of gone out of style because they're too dangerous for children. You know, kids might go ow if they get hit with one, so they use other materials that are much, much safer. Usually horsetail whips, and that way the passersby don't get injured. And so, of course, all this together might weigh 50 or 60 pounds, and these Krampuses, they still go running and parade, and you see whole troops of Krampuses running together in costume. It's super exciting. It's super cool. So, that is, of course, the 2 ways you can see a Krampus in its natural habitat. I just wanted to conclude by talking a little bit about what Krampus means for any practitioner of modern Germanic paganism, because this is one tradition that has, in some form or other, managed to survive the change from pre-Christian to Christian culture in the Alps and in southern Germany. And of course, most of the exact knowledge of what the beliefs were, who Perchta was, who the Perchten were, all of that has been lost. We have only the traditions that survived and evolved and grew and changed as the people doing them evolved and grew and changed with them. And so we just have to look at these traditions and see as best we can what it must have been like before. You know, the traditional view of Frau Perchta as this iron-nosed, evil-old hag who beats up children and terrorizes those who don't keep their own home in order, it's undergone a lot of nuance and re-understanding. She still is, in a lot of ways, a goddess you don't want to mess with. But then again, so is Hecate, so is the Morrigan. And most pagans will understand that none of these goddesses are what we would consider to be evil or bad. It's just that things have to be a certain way, and you have to be able to live up to certain standards when you're working with them. And so she is a mother goddess figure who can be found all over Germany and Austria. In northern Germany, more by Silesia, Prussia, she is called Frau Holle or Frau Holda. And there she is known to lead the wild hunt. Instead of Odin, it's her. She is actually one of my primary goddesses that I work with. And I find it very interesting how the Perchten, of course, would be very much participants in a wild hunt if you think about it. They go around from home to home, keeping order and terrorizing people. And so it's possible that the Perchten were kind of some variation of a wild hunt back in the old days. Maybe the mother goddess would go through and make sure everything was clean and in order because, guess what? It's the dead of winter in the middle of the Alps. Cold, dark, snowy time of year. You gotta make sure your clothing is in order or you're gonna freeze to death. So it's those kinds of considerations that, you know, come into it. And another interesting thing I noticed about Frau Perchta as I was researching this is she is closely linked. One of her sacred nights that she sends the Perchten out running is on Epiphany Day, which is roughly around the same time as the Celtic Imbolc and the Norse Disavlot, when the female ancestral spirits are called upon to help protect the hearth and home. So it's very interesting that might be in some way linked with the idea of like a protective spirit for the home, also being linked with a sense of danger, or maybe it was just turned into a sense of danger. Maybe the Perchten weren't always so bad. But unfortunately, like I said, we just don't have enough information surviving from how it was seen back then to know exactly how it would be today. So we just follow along and do our best with what we can figure out now. Obviously, of course, most of us don't believe that the Perchten are literally the unbaptized children who were unable to go to heaven or hell, and thus were forced to walk the earth forever until Frau Perchta gathered them up and had them follow her around for all eternity. But that was how the Christians explained it. So Krampus then, in the Germanic pagan tradition, is an interesting descendant and hybrid of both the pre-Christian and the Christian traditions that have evolved and grown over Western Austria from the before times to now. He is a figure in both the pagan and the Christian world, who has a job and a meaning and a role in both. And so he may well have been an ancient nature god who then served a goddess, ran with her in a wild hunt, and now finds employment with a Christian saint so he can continue to spread his havoc and ring his bells. I think we'll close it up there.
Yeah. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Mari.
Mari who?
Mari Lou.